We're going to be starting chapter 2. You have probably noticed in this class we're not typically in a hurry, and we're not in a hurry either. Our goal is going to be to get through chapters 1, 2, and 3, so we'll get to our first exam. Sometime during our prep time for chapter 2, I will be sending you guys information on how to download a piece of software. It's a free piece of software called Lockdown Browser. Has anybody ever used it? Yeah, it's just, all it does is locks down your computer so that you can't get to other websites during a test. And so we'll be downloading that together. In fact, I'll be doing a future assignment where you basically will do a mock test just to make sure it works on your computer. So we'll be taking care of that. We've got lots of time between now and our first test, but our first test will occur before the midterm. Now, guys, I was saying to a few folks who were coming early this morning, I'm a little behind schedule this week. It's been a busy week in my administrative life. I have not started grading your LinkedIn profiles. My goal is to get started on that today. My goal is to have your first round of grading done for everybody by the end of the week. You obviously know your economic systems, or not your economic systems, your 5 environments of businesses also due this evening. So guys, my goal will be to be completely caught up on grading with this class by next Monday. So I apologize for the lateness on my part. A lot of moving parts on campus this week. My turnaround is usually a lot quicker, but we also have an exceptionally large class. Guys, the economic systems exercise and an online discussion post are both going to be due on the 20th. We're going to cover those in class, so don't even worry about those. Right now, I want your main concern, your main worry to be, if I give you changes to make on your LinkedIn profile, prioritize that. We're going to go through these things in class, so I do not want you to worry about those. So right now, your responsibilities for right now are to make sure, bless you, that if I send you changes, that you make them on your LinkedIn profile. Past that, guys, some of the common errors that people make. This is probably the number one error, that people don't claim their custom URL. They submit their profile with a standard web address, so you can claim a very good web address. For example, if my web address for my LinkedIn profile was LinkedIn/n/Kent P. Tonkin versus LinkedIn/n Kent P. Tonkin 867-5309-24621, which is the better web address? The first one, for sure. Why is it? Why is that a better address? Yeah, it sticks in your brain. Putting a string of numbers on a business card is no good. Putting your number or your name on your business card with your LinkedIn address is great. So a lot of people make the mistake there. In terms of the summary statement, your big statement about yourself, don't worry about how long that is, because most of you have not had long and storied careers yet. It's not a bad thing to say, I'm a student athlete, I'm an accounting major, I like to do these things. Don't worry about having a book there yet, because you're at the beginning of your careers. Now, grammar is a big concern. It's one of these things, if you ever are questioning if your own writing is any good, what's a good thing to do before you submit and sign? Oh, proofread it for sure. What about having somebody else proofread it for you, too? Here's one of the things, yeah, the writing, who said the writing stuff? Excellent. Hey, here's a little secret. I'm way older than you guys, and I still use the Writing Center for some of my assignments for my doctoral work, because they're great at telling you when your citations are good. They're great at getting you out of your own head. Once you've read something so many times, you sometimes quit seeing the mistakes, and they really help you. What does good grammar, what message does good grammar and good composition send to a potential employer? Bless you. What message does a well-written profile send to a potential employer? Yes? You got it. There's an old expression, and I love applying this in life. How a person does one thing is how a person does everything. What does that expression mean? Anybody know what that means? What does that mean? How a person does one thing is how a person does everything. What's that mean? Yeah, what's that mean? Here's what it means, yes.
It means that if you put care and attention, give detail to attention, and all things, you're going to.
Exactly. Guys, I'm here to tell you, as much as I'd love to tell you I'm a neat freak, if you ever get in my car, it's a bit of a horror show. You get in there and there's clutter. There's old CDs. I hate to say this, you might even find a sheets bag in there because I had breakfast on the way to work. If you come to my office, it's not necessarily the cleanest place either. I'm trying to get better at it. My point is my personal habits transcend different places. how you represent yourself in one area is indicative of how you represent yourself in other areas. I would bet that people who have good LinkedIn profiles also submit good assignments whenever they work in their classes, for example. So you're sending a message about yourself. In terms of experience, if you have not yet had a job, do not fear. You can use all kinds of things as experience. What's something that you may have done in high school, for example? What's something you may have done in high school? What's something you may have done in high school that an employer might be interested in? Yeah, exactly. Clubs are great. What message do clubs send to a potential employer? You were involved in high school with a club. What message does that send? Yes?
Good socially.
Yeah, you're social, you're approachable. What else might it send? What other message might that send? Anybody have an idea? Yes?
You care enough to enroll in the extracurricular.
For sure, it says you got a good heart, that you like to get involved, you care about your community. If you held office, it shows you're not afraid of responsibility. So even if you did volunteer work, or if you did work with a charity, or if you did work in your school, put that down as experience, because it's okay. If you haven't had a job yet, do not fear. That's good experience. What that tells an employer, it tells them the kind of skills you're likely to have. And how to get a perfect score? How you get a perfect score is simply by making the changes I ask you to make. So guys, we're going to start off a little today with a discussion about something. This is breaking news, literally as of this morning, guys. Check this out. We've got a group from Hong Kong that wants to buy the London Stock Exchange. Guys, before I play you a video about this, why has Hong Kong been in the news so much the last couple of weeks? Does anybody know? What's going on in Hong Kong? There are riots in Hong Kong. Do you know what they're about? Well, that's a good overarching statement. Basically, what's going on in Hong Kong right now, Hong Kong was originally a colony of what European country? Yep, they gave them back to the Chinese government, and they're in transitional rule. I forget the actual date that they will transition completely back to Chinese rule. But right now, they are a semi-autonomous section of China. They're actually part of China, but they are semi-autonomous. So they're self-governing, they're self-ruling, and there's been some question about how much pressure the Chinese government will be able to put on Hong Kong. So the very fact that Hong Kong is an economic stronghold, they're actually, when you look at it, one of the most productive parts of China, not just in factories, but intellectual property. Now we got a group from there trying to buy the London Stock Exchange. Ironic considering that London, the girl. You remember about Ebenezer Scrooge. Where does Ebenezer Scrooge meet his debtors? He meets them at the exchange. We're talking about the stock market. Guys, I know it's something we're going to be covering in a later chapter, but who here can tell me how, in general, how does the stock market work? What is the nature of the stock market? Yes?
Companies offer basically part of their company up for sale, and it's publicly traded, so anybody can buy it, and the exchanges handle all the companies.
That's exactly right. That's a fantastic summary. So if I have a quote-unquote publicly traded company, that means all of you as members of the general public are welcome to own part of my company. You can buy a share of my stock. And they're traded on exchanges, which means people buy and sell parts of these companies. If a stock is popular, the price might go up. If the stock is not so popular, the price might bottom out. It's a way that companies can very quickly raise lots of revenue to do things like expand their company, expand their offerings. Some of the most valuable stocks in the world are people like Amazon, for example. Their shares are regularly trading close to $2,000 a share. And I'll tell you, if you had the foresight to buy a share of Apple back in the 1990s, a couple of shares of that, and you'd be sitting pretty today. So here's my question, though. Since we're talking about buying and selling shares of companies, do these shares actually physically exist? No, you can't. It'd be pretty amazing. Like, I own a couple of shares of Planet Fitness. I don't know if I could go into the one in Altoona and take a piece of it home with me and say, I've got 2 shares, so I'm taking 2 pieces of your gym home with me. I can't do that. It's all mainly digital. So one of the questions we're running into in the 21st century is, do we really need stock exchanges then? Couldn't this all be handled online? What do you think? I mean, when you think about it, we're talking about electronic transactions, yes?
So like in a stock exchange, like before computers, if you wanted to one, you would like have to physically go in there to trade and buy stock into a stock exchange.
There was still some element of computers starting in about the 70s and the 80s, but it was still largely a manual process. So say, for example, you're a broker and I'm a customer, and I want to buy several shares of IBM. I'm going to call you and say, I want 5 shares. You're going to ask me what I'm willing to pay for it. And I've been following, this is the 80s, remember. I've been following it in the Wall Street Journal. I think $29 a share is a fair price. So you basically will go and try to negotiate with somebody who owns shares of IBM for that price. They may say $29 isn't enough. How about $29.75? You'll come back to me and ask me if that's a fair price or not. Most of those processes and the way we do that stuff is automated now. It's done through supercomputer systems, places like the New York Stock Exchange, places like the London Stock Exchange. But you notice that one of the journalists said there's a lot of consolidation going on in the industry. Guys, what does consolidation do? It's the opposite of expansion. What's consolidation? Yes. Yeah, so we're saying basically we're going to pull resources and have fewer groups doing this that are going to concentrate things like computing power and infrastructure to do this ourselves. Guys, the reason this is happening, and I encourage you to ask Dr. Keeley about this. How many of you have Dr. Keeley for finance? Ask her this question. I would encourage you to consider why we still have real stock exchanges and why this isn't all just automated at this point in time. That's why this is a big deal. If you're in London, however, it's a matter of national pride that your stock exchange, which by the way is also publicly traded, is owned by people in the country. Questions or comments, guys? Does that all make sense? This was a very impromptu lecture on the nature of securities, because we're going to be getting into that in our Chapter 19 session. And what I'm telling you, keep in mind, what I'm telling you is about this much information. Yes?
So if they would purchase the LSE, would they keep it in London, or would they try to outsource it back to Hong Kong?
That's a really good question. I can imagine, based on public sentiment, does anybody here have friends or know people from England, for example? Yeah, they have a very strong national pride, don't they? Just like we do in the United States. And if you're a capitalist country, which England is, it was one of the first, I think London was the first stock exchange. There's a big bit of national pride. They're saying we don't want somebody outside our country to own it. It's basically, for example, if somebody, I'm trying to even think of something as iconic. If somebody wanted to buy Wall Street that wasn't American, we would probably feel weird about that. So I think it's going to come down to public sentiment. The same token, you saw what the market value was doing. It was going up. Yes?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask about that. Is just the Hong Kong exchange that powerful?
Bless you.
People have more confidence in London after an offer because, you know, it pushed the stock up that quickly.
Well, I'm going to give you a very, I apologize for getting a lot of long answers, but here's my theory on it. What is England, what is the UK facing in the next 30 days? Month and a half, Brexit. And they can't come to consensus how they're going to be doing this. Basically, England is leading the European Union. They've been very financially intertwined with the European Union for decades now, and now we're talking about a hard pullout of one of the largest economies. So we had a situation where England had open borders and open commerce. Now we're going to have to renegotiate essentially trade deals and all these things. Let's compare that scenario to the most quickly growing economies in the world, which are based where? Does anybody know where the fastest growing economies are?
The East.
You got it. If we could have GDP growth like China has, China is the #2 GDP, gross domestic product, in the world. They leapfrogged Japan in the last decade. Our GDP is hovering right around 20 trillion. China's is about 12. So they very quickly became the #2 economy. If current trends continue, and this is the way of the world, China will be the #1 economy probably within the next 15 to 20 years, if not sooner. So if I were putting money into an economy, I would be strongly considering investing in China or other parts of the world. I don't say that as a statement against my own country. I say that as that is a financial reality. The Beijing Auto Show is the largest car show in the world now. It's bigger than Detroit because it's a bigger market. What do you think? Am I on point, or what would you say about the, because that was a great question you asked. Does that make sense? Okay. Guys, any other comments or questions? I don't mind getting a little off topic because this was news I found out on my way into work today. And guys, I also don't mind taking a minute or a couple of minutes to honor the significance of the day. We're talking 18 years on from the largest attack on American soil that we ever faced. And it was actually an attack directly on symbols involved in our commerce. The Twin Towers, does anybody know what they were actually called? What's their name? Yes.
The World Trade Center.
So when we had these attacks happen back in 2001, what was the symbology? I need to hear from this side of the room today. What was the symbology of these attacks? Why did they attack the World Trade Centers? Anybody have a thought? Yes, ma'am.
Because that was like the most prideful thing we had back in that day.
Definitely was a matter of national pride, yes.
It was an attack on the capitalism.
It was a symbol of American capitalism, which some philosophies and religions, for example, or fragments of religions, don't necessarily agree with. So this was a direct statement against the capitalist way of life as well. Guys, the plane that went down in Shanksville literally flew over St. Francis University. I was working on September 11th, and I remember we were watching the news. I was watching the news in the conference room. I had come in at about 8:30 in the morning, and or a little after that, and people were already watching the first hole in the Trade Center. We had thought this has to be an accident of some kind. And I was watching live when the second plane hit. And I can't describe to you the chill that ran up my spine and realizing that this was, honest to God, a war starting in front of our eyes. We were later in the day had heard that a plane went down in Shanksville. Shanksville is less than an hour. Well, it's about an hour's drive from here. Has anybody ever been to the Shanksville Memorial? Am I alone in saying that there's a chill in the air there that's something you can't quite describe? Yeah, it's a very different feeling when you realize what happened there. And so I'm going to eat up a few minutes of class today to kind of play a video commemorating what it was to be discussed and unpacked here too. Guys, during that day, we were trying to make a phone call anywhere on the East Coast for the first half of the day. It was impossible. Does anybody know why? Well, overloaded the system is a big part of it. We also were losing significant internet connectivity as well, because what a lot of people don't realize, when you get into places like New York City, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, major cities are also major telecommunications hubs. So an event like this also knocked down communications, knocked down internet, knocked down telephone. This was a real blow also in the fact that we had just come off of a bubble in our economy starting to burst. Does anybody know what that bubble might have been? It was called the dot-com bubble. From 1995 to about 2000 or so, the economy in the United States was going crazy because the internet had just become publicly available. People were all about e-commerce and saying, how can we develop this new economy? And so we had a scenario where our economy had just tanked and was starting to crawl back out. And then we had the events of 9/11, which did not do wonders for the economy either. The stock markets were closed for a few days. What happens oftentimes with markets? World events can affect them. How can world events possibly affect stock trading? Something like this. How would an event like this maybe affect people making money? Yes?
Defense spending is going to go through the roof.
Well, defense would be one area, for example. When I say this, I'm not advocating war profiteering. We're just talking about the effects here. But defense, definitely. If you've got a publicly traded company that deals with defense, it could be good for you. Could there be negative effects? What might be a negative effect? Yes?
The worth of the currency.
Yeah, if your currency is not doing well, which our currency did see a downturn during this period. Are people dispirited too? Yeah, of course. If we're just finding out we're in a war, am I really going to be thinking about investing and doing trades? Yes.
Also, can drive like people get rich with stocks, being wrapped and sell.
And get the cash out of the markets. You guys, a big reason for the stock market crash in 1939 is when the markets were taking a dive, people started pulling their money out of the stock market too, which caused that system to implode. So world events like this, as tragic as they may be, also can affect other things like business. It was a rough decade because not too long after these events, we also had the events that happened leading up to the financial crash of 2008. What this all points to, guys, is you all in your place in life have inherited a very complex financial system, and some of these events are the reasons why. Questions or comments? Questions or comments about anything? It's funny, every time I feel like I've forgotten about this day, it comes. and you realize what day it is, and you remember exactly where you were when it happened. I think you may have heard your parents or your grandparents talk about where they were the day that Ronald Reagan was shot, or your great-grandparents talking about the day Kennedy was shot. And for my generation, at Gen X, this was our event. Yes?
Yeah, I don't remember it, but my dad and mom told me that I was just sitting, because I was like 1 years old, I was sitting in their laps, and as soon as it happened, my dad tried to call my uncle because he worked in the power plant in New York and make sure he was okay.
Wow. It's kind of one of these things that's in the memory of your generation. I would say, and feel free to disagree, guys, but I think that this is one of the things that's kind of the hallmarks of your generation. In fact, this is probably one of the things that set the tone for the world that you've grown up in. You know, I remember as somebody older than you a time when we weren't involved in multiple wars, and you guys don't. So it's a different take on the world. It's not right or wrong. It's just different. Yes.
I know for me and a couple of the other upperclassmen, we were talking about this in class yesterday because it was just related to material. But we found it interesting that it's starting to be taught as a historical event.
Yeah.
Because even between the upperclassmen and the freshman class now, I mean, I was either 3 or 4 when it happened, so I was still really young. But I don't know. To me, it's always been, it was a current event.
Sure.
So now that it's being taught as a historical event, it feels weird that high schoolers they weren't alive. There's a definite shift in how people feel about it too.
For sure.
Historical.
One of the best jokes I've heard about history is the only constant about history is our ability to forget it. And the idea of being somebody who was an adult when this happened, I have a different recollection than some folks do. I think one of the most interesting conversations I've ever had as a teacher was during last spring. I had a seminar class, and many of my students, their first memories that they could distinctly remember were being picked up from school in 9/11. They were just people slightly older than you guys who were old enough to have that memory. So thank you for that contribution. Any other comments or thoughts? Well, guys, as you go through your day, take a minute to remember the people who did good things and tried to help that day. And, hopefully we can avoid there being another 9/11 in your generation. So, guys, what we're going to be talking about today is really understanding how the markets work. Well, not the markets like the stock market, but how capitalism, how free trade works, how different economic systems play different roles in different countries. When I make these statements, guys, you're going to actually be doing an assignment that's going to request that you compare 2 economic systems, and I'm going to be asking you to give me your opinions on them. Flat out, even though I'm a free market capitalist, you can completely disagree with me and still get an A on the assignment. For example, there are many people who are starting to like the idea of more social kinds of programs, socialism, I might even say, becoming a part of the United States. And if that's your opinion, I support you in expressing your opinion. But we're going to learn about the advantages and disadvantages of all these systems. Generally speaking, how do we refer to the United States? What's our economic system? How do we work? Yes, Jackson?
Capitalist.
Yeah, we're capitalists. And when we say we're capitalists, what does that mean? In your own words, what's capitalism? Yeah, go ahead.
Free trade and allowing the market to regulate itself.
It's basically the idea of buying and selling what you want. We call them free and open economies. Now, capitalism comes with advantages and disadvantages. We're going to be talking about those. We're also going to compare it to groups such as, or economic systems such as socialism and communism. There's a new emerging trend that we're seeing happening in places like Hong Kong and more directly China, we refer to as mixed economies that have elements of both. And to some extent, we have some elements of socialist kinds of principles and parts of our systems here in the United States as well. So we're going to start off today by talking about economics, what that actually is. How many of you are enrolled in an economics class at the same time? Some of this may seem a little redundant. It's definitely going to be more superficial compared to what you're getting from a class from Mr. Norris or Dr. Timmons, for example, or Ms. Dunlap. We're going to be comparing how the free markets work in a capitalist economy versus more command economies and communist systems, for example. We're also going to be talking about how we know our economy is doing well versus how we know we're not doing well. So we're going to be comparing these policies as well. We're also going to talk about the differences between fiscal and monetary policy. When we talk about economics, what we're really talking about is measuring how money moves through an economy, how money moves through a country. So how do people choose what they're going to buy? How do we consume? What are things that we're spending? For example, if we're buying lots of cars, that's good news for an economy. It means people have disposable income. If we're buying lots of building supplies, I want to hear from this side of the room. Why would an uptake in the sales of building supplies indicate good things happening in our economy? Yes.
If you're like running out of supplies, that means you're doing like good business, so you keep purchasing more. Those businesses do better. It's just better for everybody.
Yes, we're obviously doing well if we're running out of stuff. And if we're building homes, people have optimism for the future because your home is going to be your biggest investment for most people in their lifetime. When we're studying different kinds of economics, we're studying an entire country's economy. We're looking at the United States, how are we doing as a country? We're talking about macroeconomics. The word macro, or the part of the word macro, means big. Micro means small. So we're looking at microeconomics. We're looking within specific areas or markets. So, for example, if I'm looking at the health of the United States, that's a macroeconomic measure. If I'm looking at the economy of Pennsylvania, that's microeconomic. Who here can tell me, what is the unemployment rate in the United States as a whole right now? Anybody know? What is it? Yeah, it's less than 4%. We're doing pretty good. Can anybody tell me what the unemployment rate is in Johnstown? It's closer to like 15. So we got a bigger unemployment rate in Johnstown than we have in the economy as a whole. So by a macroeconomic measure, hey, we're doing great in this country. It can look a little less optimistic if you're in places where there are not jobs. So sometimes microeconomics and macroeconomic measures counteract each other. So in terms of economics, if you're lucky, if you're born into a country that's got great resources, you're more likely to have a good economy. For example, we've got all kinds of resources here in the United States. We've got a talented labor pool. We've got tons of natural resources. Guys, we're the largest exporter and producer of petroleum in the world right now. We're bigger than the UAE and Saudi Arabia here in the United States. Does anybody know why that is? What has enabled us to become that number one manufacturer? Yes?
Offshore drilling.
Well, offshore drilling is part of it. There's something else that's endemic to this region. Anybody heard of the term before? Begins with fracking. Isn't that funny? That's like the worst name ever. Whoever came up with that name for an industry is like, they need to talk to a marketing person. Like, frack sounds like you're using it as a substitute for an F-bomb. This test is so fracking hard, for example. It sounds terrible. They need somebody else to come up with a better name than frack. But that's part of the reason we're able to do it. Guys, we got tons of tillable land. They used to call the Midwest the breadbasket to the world because we made so much wheat in this country. And we also, guys, we pioneered a lot of things. If I'm sounding very pro-America today, I don't mean to sound like I'm putting anybody else down. I just am talking about what I know. Guys, in terms of creating goods and services, you know, we're standing in the middle of the country that developed the internet. We're standing in the middle of the country that perfected the automobile and the production line. We had a lot of good ideas that emanated from this country. So do other countries. So if you have ways to develop goods and services, having a big country and lots of resources is a pretty good way to do it. So if you think about the major inventions of the last 20th century, a lot of them came from here. So, guys, there are contrasts abound, however. If we look at the difference between Seoul, which is in South Korea, which is one of the most technologically adept cities in the world, versus living conditions in North Korea, what's the difference? They're both on the same peninsula. So why is South Korea doing so much better than North Korea? Any thoughts? Yes?
So, is adapted to a free market, I guess. I got capitalist. North Korea is communist, and they're not doing so.
Yeah, they're not doing too well at all. In fact, North Korea is so dependent on foreign aid, without it, most of the people would starve. We've got a system that cannot feed its own people, that puts its priorities on military spending over taking care of its own people, versus a democratic system in the South. And by the way, democratic and capitalist systems are not without their faults either. For example, in Seoul, South Korea, or in South Korea as a whole, you still have to compete and make your way in the markets. By the way, who here can tell me a big Korean brand? What is a big brand of automobile that comes from Korea? Hyundai, Korean cars. And by the way, Hyundai, if you drove a Hyundai in the 90s, people would laugh at you saying, man, you can't afford anything better. And their cars are definitely world class now. They're very good automobiles. Compare that to North Korea, where you can't even feed your own people. Guys, they have black markets in Korea or in North Korea where you literally will go down to the square on a Saturday or Sunday morning and try to trade things for essentials. I don't have razor blades, so maybe I can trade some potatoes for some razor blades. There's still a black market and a barter system because their markets are so dysfunctional as a whole. So guys, here's my question for you, and I want to hear from both sides of the room here, guys. We're talking about all these big ideas. We're talking about what's going to change the world. What do you think? What are going to be the next big things? What's going to power our economy in the next century? Globally, what are going to be our big businesses? We got a hand over here.
Technology developing companies.
Definitely. Is there a particular area you think is going to take off?
I just think like robotics and AI are going to be the biggest.
I agree with you completely. And we've scratched the surface on what AI is going to do in this century. Over here. Here's some ideas. What's going to happen in the economy? You guys are business people. What do you think what's going to take off? What do you think? Yes.
Computers.
Tell me more.
Well, computers are already, computers just a couple years ago they're like foreign. Then you can put them on the desk, and you can put them on your lap, carry them in your hands, and we're just looking for more and more processing power. We're going to decentralize stuff like stock exchanges. We're going to have to find a way to put enough power in people's homes to run bigger and bigger programs.
We're right. I agree. What do you think?
I think cybersecurity will be a huge different type of like specifically because I think like we're talking about all this automation and software and stock exchanges and stuff, and there's a lot of stuff that needs to be private and secure, and with a lot of talk of like hacking and stuff like that, I think that like. Remember the other week we were talking about like EMPs and stuff like that,
sure.
Electromagnetic pulses, like if we really put a lot of our security and rely on everything's online, we could lose thousands of records, like or millions of records like that. So I forget what class I learned this in, but like it's one of the cybersecurity is a market that is like has a lot of potential for the next.
We're putting it all online. We got to protect it, right?
Yeah. So anyways, I think cybersecurity must improve as we continue to rely more on these.
I completely agree. What do you guys think? What are going to be the next big markets?
I honestly think that. Well, I think like Uber, it's already big, but like I feel like it should get big. Like.
So, ride sharing, automation, that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
From this side of the room, go ahead.
I was going to say automation in agriculture.
Yeah, think about it. Factory farms have nowhere to go but up. We're creating more people all the time, and we like to eat. I completely agree. One more from this side of the room. What else is going to be a big market? Yes?
I think, for example, like automobiles for less pollution, things that would have like a go green effect.
So more environmental ways of doing things we're already doing. I agree. You guys have lots of good ideas here, guys. I think that in terms of the economy itself, we may hit a point where we're going backwards instead of forwards, and I mean that in a good way. Let me give you an example. We have a big emphasis in this day in time on things that are disposable. The one thing we can't create any more of, however, is planting. We're going to run out of places to get rid of our garbage, to be completely honest with you. There are ways we're thinking now, can we create garbage not create garbage, but create services that will turn that garbage into energy? Can we come up with ways to better recycle? Can we come up with lower polluting approaches to this stuff? So yeah, it's a big deal. And in terms of production, guys, when we're starting to talk about feeding the world, how many people do we have in the world at this point in time? Anybody know? We're closing in on 7 billion? 8 billion. So, guys, in our country, we face the issue, some of us anyway, of having too much to eat. And there are people around the world who aren't getting enough to eat. And as those populations increase, we're going to have to come up with new and creative ways to be able to feed all these folks. So we've got production challenges ahead of us. Guys, in terms of how we create a good economy or create wealth for everyone, our good friend Thomas Malthus basically said that he called economics the dismal science. And why he called economics the dismal science, he didn't predict any good news. He thought that basically too much power was concentrated in too few people who were making decisions for themselves. We refer to it as has anybody ever heard the expression the top 1%? What do we mean when somebody says that? We're talking about the top 1%. What do we mean? Yeah.
1% of people control like 50% of the wealth.
Exactly. And Malthus basically said, well, and I misstated that Thomas Malthus didn't coin the term the dismal science, Thomas Carl did. But he basically said what Thomas Malthus was saying, if we have too few people controlling the wealth, they're going to make decisions that are only going to benefit them. Although our world is not getting as crowded as quickly as we predicted, ultimately we're going to run out of resources if we don't change the way we're doing things. Now, if you get into, for example, we don't spend a lot of time on the philosophy of this because it's kind of baked into what we're talking about. Other folks, as opposed to Malthus, thought that having a big population was a good thing because you could develop and empower them. So the more people you have, the more skills you have, the more of a high-powered economy you can grow. Countries like China and Japan are great examples of this because they have had very highly educated populations, for example, who've been very productive. Now we get into something called the creation of wealth, and we're talking about the invisible hand. Who here has ever heard of the invisible hand? If you haven't heard of it, here's the way it works. Let's say, for example, I'm a business owner, and I'm able to do production pretty much unfettered. I start a successful company, and I hire half the people in this room. You guys are doing well because the company's doing well. If you guys have big money in your pockets, these guys over here all own small businesses. What are you guys going to do with your money? Yeah, absolutely. What do you guys? By the way, what are we selling? What's your business? What do you sell? We got a phone salesman here. What do you sell?
I do like food.
What kind of food? I'm hungry.
Pizza.
Pizza. Awesome. What kind of business you got? Clothes. What kind of business do you have? Cars. We got cars over here. So you guys are going to be spending all your money with these folks. And after they're spending all their money with other folks who have businesses, and the money moves throughout the economy. Adam Smith also believed that if you paid people well and fairly, they would work hard for rewards. If I believe, for example, that I'm working for one of your companies, you're going to treat me fairly, I'm going to work hard to earn that reward. So it was kind of an idea of an optimistic view of trickle-down economics. In reality, it doesn't always happen. Do companies always pay their employees fairly? No, they don't, because if it depends who's running the company. You have people, for example, who have the attitude that I want to pay my employees as little as I have to get as much as I can. Yes, sir.
An interesting thing I actually learned in psychology that relates to business. We learned about how money actually really doesn't incentivize people. That like race and stuff won't make them work harder. What really makes people work well, work harder, is the feeling of control and empowerment. And actually, Google does this, and they give their employees like a couple hours each day of just complete freedom, like do whatever you want, like have like a brainstorming session. Anyways, I don't know why I just put that up.
No, that's a good point. And here we'll talk more about that when we get into HR. But go ahead.
I just wanted to bounce off that because we went over that in the management class last year, and at that time I was still driving for Roaring Spring, and I was talking about it with one of my coworkers because I was riding with him, and his take on it was kind of funny because he drove truck for 40 years or 30 years at this point, and he just kind of looked at me and was like, "Well, that's why I'm here," you know. And it's kind of funny because you can't keep people motivated, but your workers think that's what motivates them.
We've gone off on a lot of tangents, David. I'm going to do one more because it's not always a linear equation. Let's say, for example, I've got my friends on this side of the room, and you guys are all making $3 million a year. Pretty nice, right? Not bad for a first job out of college. You guys are making $3 million a year. You guys on this side have started your first jobs and you're making $18,000 a year. Who here is more stressed about paying their light bill? You guys here are stressed about it. Do you guys have a care in the world over here? Your cares in the world, you're thinking Bugatti versus BMW, depending on how high on you want to go. Money is a motivator at lower wages more than it is at higher wages. If you're Tim Cook and you're the CEO of Apple and you make more money than God, is he really going to switch jobs over a $500,000 difference? No, he's going to go where he's enjoying himself and feeling motivated or putting his power in the world because he's never going to spend all the money he has. That person who's making $7.50 at McDonald's, when the price of gas goes up $1 a gallon, they're choosing between what food they're putting on the table while gas is going in the tank. So money is a motivator at lower levels of employment. It's not as much of a motivator as you move up to Maslow's theory of hierarchy of needs and self-actualization, which we're going to talk about. What do you guys think? Is money a motivator to people who are higher wage earners? Feel free to disagree with me. Are there any folks? Yes.
I think that's one of the best spins I've ever heard of on it, because in my management class, we just kind of went over Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And like I said, my coworker was like, "Well, I'm showing up for the money."
Right.
He wasn't showing up for anything else. But yeah, because I can definitely see both sides. Because I did temp work for a while, and I can see people were a lot more happy where they had that freedom. But bottom line, you still have to be, especially when you get into temp work, it's just bottom line is paycheck.
I'll leave you guys with this because we're at time. I make less money than I made in my job 10 years ago, but I love my current job more. I would not go back to my old job, even if they were paying me twice as much as they're paying me here, because I love what I do. And I feel like at the end of the day, I'm self-actualized. Do what makes you happy, and the money will follow. Have a good day, guys.